Alright, in this video I want to talk about quarantining your new ball python. I've seen a lot of you guys, you're picking up snake after snake after snake. It seems like, you know, you were kind of like me at the beginning when you start picking up a lot of ball pythons pretty much back to back. And I think at the beginning you really don't think about quarantining until you get to a certain point. Maybe you have 8 or 9 or 10 ball pythons, and then when you bring in a ball python you start thinking, you know, this ball python might have mites or respiratory infection, and if it infects your whole collection, let me tell you, at one point I had 150 snakes in this room, and let me tell you, if I brought mites into this room and infected my collection, it would be a nightmare. I couldn't even imagine mites going through my collection. It would really be devastating for me. So at this point, I would probably seriously consider doing a quarantine as part of buying new ball pythons. As a matter of fact, I haven't bought a new ball python in years, and I'm almost afraid to buy one because if I brought something into my collection, it would be that devastating. And I produced so many ball pythons. You know, last year I produced 100 hatchlings. This year I'll probably produce between 70 and, if Lucy lays, maybe 120, 130. Let me tell you, that's a lot of snakes I'm producing. So in order to, you know, take the risk of buying another snake and bringing it into this room and starting another project, let me tell you, there is a huge risk of bringing something in here unless you do some kind of a quarantine. And I would say the biggest thing as far as quarantine, especially with ball pythons, there's really only 2 things that you really have to worry about. Number 1 is mites. Mites are like little fleas that kind of burrow in the scales of your ball pythons, and every now and then you'll see like a little mite crawling across the top of your ball python, but most of the times you won't, and those mites will be burrowed into the scales and you won't even see them. They'll look like little black specks. And if you had a snake like this is my pastel calico female. If you had a snake like this that had mites, let me tell you, you wouldn't know in most cases, because it has the kind of the dark coloration, has a lot of really kind of a freckled pattern. It would be really difficult to see mites on a snake like this. But if you had a white snake, it'd be really easy because you'd see all these little black speckles all over. And a lot of times, especially on a white snake, what you'll see is where the mite actually crawls out from between the scales, and it'll leave a little red spot. So in addition to all the little black freckles from the actual mites burrowed into the scales, you'll also see little tiny red spots, and that's where the mite went in, and they actually suck the blood from the snake, and then they come out, and then they go into another spot, leaving these red little spots all over. And it's really hard on the snake having mites, especially if they go unchecked. I had a really bad mite infection when I started out, and let me tell you, it went through my whole collection, and I never quarantined. And I was pretty much probably like you, starting out buying snakes. You know, every few weeks you're buying another snake. You're taking everything and investing it into the ball pythons, you know, knowing that it's going to pay out at the end. But the beginning, it's really, you're kind of obsessed about buying into different morphs, researching everything, and then you get to the point where pretty much your whole collection's full. You have like, you know, 20 or 30 snakes or however many at the point where you stop and say, all right, this is enough. I have enough snakes. And then I think the buying impulse kind of wears off after that first year, and you end up with like 100 hatchlings, and pretty soon you're like me, 150 snakes, and you're like, all right, I think I have enough snakes. And then when you have that many snakes, let me tell you, if you're thinking about buying into another project, for me, it's almost terrifying thinking about bringing something else into the room and possibly infecting the rest of my snakes. So I would say at this point, if I was going to buy into another project, I would definitely quarantine. And for quarantining, ideally, especially for mites, what you'd really want is you'd want a separate enclosure, a separate setup in a completely different room. As a matter of fact, you'd probably want to think about keeping it in a separate house. You know, like maybe your mother-in-law's house or your father-in-law's house, or maybe, you know, show up at your mom's and say, hey mom, I want to buy another snake. Can I use your bedroom for my snake rack for a while? I don't know if that would go over with your mom. Let me tell you, it wouldn't go over with my mom, but that would really be ideal, because remember, the mites, when they come out of your snakes and they start crawling around, they can actually hitchhike on your clothes. As a matter of fact, if you go to a reptile show and you come back after that reptile show, before you go into your reptile room, I would highly recommend changing all your clothes, taking all your clothes off and throwing them in the washing machine, because if you have even one single mite and you go from a reptile show or a pet store or a reptile store and you walk into your reptile room, let me tell you, just walking in, you can infect your whole collection. And I always think about that when I'm visiting these other places. I'm like, man, I gotta, you know, get rid of my clothes and take a shower and make sure that there's not a mite. And let me tell you, if you had one tiny little microscopic mite somewhere, you wouldn't even know it, and you have the potential of infecting your whole collection. So that's probably the number one. And then the number two thing is respiratory infections. And respiratory infections, I think it's pretty much a local case. You know, I've had respiratory infections before and they don't really go through your whole collection. The only way you can really move it from snake to snake is if you used the same tub. So if I had a snake with a respiratory infection, and I moved him out of a tub, didn't clean that tub, and I moved another snake into that tub, I would imagine that that snake could catch the respiratory infection that way. But typically it's not airborne, and I've never really had respiratory infection go through my collection like mites. Let me tell you, mites are the number one thing that you really have to watch out for. And personally, what I would do is if I was setting up another rack just for a quarantine rack, what I would probably use is an ARS 7030. It's a 70 series rack, and these are actually 5040s over here. These are hatchling racks over here. You could go with any size. I would go with the 7030. It's a little bit bigger of a tub, and you can actually get it in a 7010, which is the 70 series tubs, but it's in a stack of just 10. And as a matter of fact, you can buy them individual levels, so you'd have essentially you could have maybe just 3 or 4 levels, and then you could buy 3 or 4 snakes, put them in the levels, keep them in a separate room, and just kind of keep an eye on them. And then I've seen a lot of people, what they'll do is in their quarantine room, this guy's kind of going all over the place. And this is a really beautiful snake. I actually bred my bamboo with this, got some bamboo calico stuff. It was really some awesome combos. She's had the year off. I'm definitely gonna breed her back to a bamboo again, probably this fall, and get some more bamboo combos. But speaking of quarantines, yeah, I've seen a lot of people on some of the YouTube videos, and what they'll do for quarantine is they'll put snakes in a tub, like in a 7030 series tub, and then they'll actually spray down the tub with like prevenamite or something like that. And let me tell you, those chemicals are really hazardous to snakes. I would not use prevenamite or any kind of insecticide or anything to treat snakes unless you actually see that they have a problem. If they have mites, I would treat them. If they had a visible respiratory infection, sometimes you can actually hear the respiratory infection, the wheezing or the coughing. But let me tell you, if you don't see any of that, I would not treat the snakes just as a prophylactic, because let me tell you, some of those treatments can actually harm the snake, and it can actually kill the snake. I've seen some people kill snakes with prevenamite, and you have to really be careful. Never spray that stuff directly on the snake. Always spray it like on the substrate and let it completely dry before you put the snake back in. Keep it out of the water, and you have to be really careful treating snakes. So I would say you'd probably want to isolate a snake, I would say, for at least 3 or 4 weeks. you know, if they have mites within 3 or 4 weeks, you're gonna see, you know, tons of mites all over the place. And probably the best thing to do is in quarantine, I would actually put this snake on a paper towel substrate, because on a paper towel you'll see the mites crawling all over the place, versus if you had like a coconut husk, you might not see the mites crawling around. And then for the respiratory infection, I would actually keep an eye on the sides of the tub. Usually what happens is when they have a respiratory infection, they kind of get like a slimy mouth, and you'll see kind of like the slime trails along the side of the tub where they actually kind of drool on the tub. You'll actually see it, and most times with the respiratory infection, you'll actually hear it before you see it, the kind of wheeze. And it's, you know, for respiratory infection, I would probably use something like a Reptifogger and dilute some F10 solution with water and do fogging in there. Probably fog once or twice a day for a couple weeks until it clears up. And as a matter of fact, I would probably quarantine for a couple months, maybe 2 to 3 months, if you had a snake with a respiratory infection, just to make sure it's completely gone before you bring it into your collection. So that's pretty much it. I know a lot of you guys are picking up a lot of snakes out there. It seems like every time I talk to some of you guys, you're like, I picked up another ball python. And you know, at the beginning, I would say if you just have a handful of snakes, it's especially if you buy like a whole bunch of snakes in a short period of time, it's almost like you're quarantining them all at the same time, because they all kind of have the same risk of carrying mites or the respiratory infection. But let me tell you, once you have some established snakes and you have an established room like this, especially if you've gone quite a while without any problems like me, let me tell you, I'm almost afraid to bring another snake in here, because I think if I was to get another snake, I would definitely do quarantine, and I would probably find someone else that would hold that snake for me. You know, someone that was close by, someone where I could check on the snake a lot and just kind of keep it away from all other snakes and keep it isolated away from my collection, away from my house. Or the other thing is if you have someone, say for example, if you have a friend who breeds snakes and they have an established collection, I've done this before, where they haven't brought any snakes into their collection in a long time. You know, they don't have any mites. You know, in that case, I would probably not worry about quarantining, because it's almost like they're their own little quarantine zone, especially if they're not going to reptile shows bringing stuff in and stuff like that. So really it depends on the situation. I'm getting to the point where the mites really kind of freak me out, because I don't want them to bring mites in here, because, you know, number one, it would take a long time to get rid of those mites. And it's a lot of work to try to go through all the tubs and clean them and spray them down and try to get the mites. They go all over the room. You know, sometimes they can, you know, go across the room, and then you're cleaning all your racks, and then a couple days later they crawl back and reinfest you. And let me tell you, it's really hard to get rid of mites. And then when you have mites, you really can't sell any snakes, because it's pretty much, you know, all the shows are canceled. You can't go to any of the shows until you get a handle on the mite situation. And for me, that would be kind of devastating, because I got a lot of snakes that I want to sell on a continual basis, and I want to go to a lot of these shows to meet a lot of people too. So that's pretty much it. That is my view on quarantining. I would highly recommend quarantining any snakes that you bring into your collection. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.